The town that woke up to 300 empty graves. It started with screams echoing through the fog at 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning. By the time Sheriff Mason Cole arrived at Cedar Hollow Cemetery, the crowd was already gathered behind the yellow police tape, staring in stunned silence. The ground looked as if something alive had clawed its way up from underneath. Row after row, more than 300 graves, stood open, their wooden coffins split and hollow. Not a single body remained. The air was thick with damp soil and disbelief. Old Mrs. Porter, who lived across the road, kept repeating the same words to anyone who'd listen. "They're gone. All of them gone." Mason's flashlight caught on something near a headstone. A perfect handprint pressed deep into the mud, fingers spread wide, pointing toward the church at the far end of the lot. No tools, no footprints, no signs of digging. Just the handprints. Hundreds of them. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. A one-road town with 2 diners, 1 church, and a graveyard that had stood since the Civil War. The storm that had rolled through the night before wasn't unusual for Louisiana. Thunder, heavy rain, and that low hum in the wind that made windows rattle. But no storm could do this. Mason knew that much. By noon, local news vans had shown up, and the pastor, Reverend Jonah Price, was on his knees near the oldest section of graves. "These were my great-grandparents," he whispered, clutching the soaked pages of a hymnal found in the dirt. Mason crouched beside him. The pages were torn, the ink smeared, but a single line stood out clear. "The unblessed shall rise when the reckoning is near." That afternoon, the parish office sent security footage from the small camera mounted near the front gate. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the lens captured a series of shadows moving between the tombstones. They weren't T-shaped like people, more like silhouettes that wavered, merging and splitting apart like smoke. And then, one frame before the feed cut out, the image froze on what looked like a face pressed against the camera glass, pale, distorted, and silent. Mason didn't believe in ghosts, but he'd been a cop long enough to know when something didn't add up. No human could move that quietly, that fast, leaving behind no trace but perfect holes in the ground. Still, he needed an answer, something to give the townspeople before panic set in. That night, he ordered the cemetery sealed, but Cedar Hollow didn't sleep. Dogs barked until dawn, and several residents claimed they heard whispering outside their windows, voices calling their names softly, like someone trying to get their attention from the dark. When morning came, Mason's deputy pounded on his door, pale as chalk. "Sheriff," he said, out of breath, "you need to see this. The graves, they're open again." Mason blinked. "What do you mean again?" The deputy swallowed hard. "The ones we filled yesterday. They're empty. Every last one." And this time, the handprints were fresh. By the second morning, Cedar Hollow didn't feel like a town anymore. It felt like a waiting room for something terrible. Reporters filled the diner, the local pastor refused to open the church, and families started digging through old records to make sure their loved ones had even been buried in the right place. Sheriff Mason Cole barely slept. He couldn't shake the sound of those whispers caught faintly on the security audio, soft, overlapping, like wind through dry leaves. But every few seconds, he swore he heard his own name. He drove back to the cemetery just after sunrise. The mist was still clinging to the ground, and the graves that had been refilled the day before now gaped open again. Same clean edges, same pattern. Mason crouched, running a gloved hand along the rim of a grave. The soil wasn't disturbed like it had been dug. It looked lifted, as though something below had pushed it up perfectly. Deputy Howard stood a few yards away, clutching a crumpled notebook. "Sir, there's something else." He pointed to a headstone marked 1894. On its surface, someone had carved words that hadn't been there yesterday. "We never rested." That's when Reverend Price arrived, out of breath, holding a faded church ledger. "This book was buried beneath the chapel floor," he said, voice trembling. "It's from 1873, before the church fire. There's a passage about a ritual called the Unburial Prayer. It says the dead who were wronged, the unblessed, could rise to demand justice if the town ever forgot them." Mason frowned. Justice for what? Price hesitated, flipping the brittle pages. There was a mining camp just outside Cedar Hollow during the war. Dozens of workers died in a cave collapse, but the company never gave them proper burials. The church buried them secretly in this cemetery, unmarked. He closed the book gently. If the story's true, those might be the graves that opened first. That afternoon, Mason called in an archaeologist from Baton Rouge, Dr. Eliza Marin, to examine the site. She was calm, methodical, the kind of person who believed every mystery had a scientific answer. But even she looked uneasy as she walked among the rows. "This isn't erosion," she murmured. "These graves were opened with precision, not by machines, by force from within." By sunset, half the town gathered behind the police barricade. The air felt charged, heavy with static. Mason tried to calm them, promising answers soon. But just as he spoke, one of the floodlights flickered, then shut off completely. The crowd gasped. In the silence that followed, a faint sound rippled through the graves, like breathing. Mason froze, flashlight trembling in his hand. Then came the whispers again, dozens of them, rising from the earth itself. Names, addresses, birthdays. People backed away, shouting. Mason turned toward the gate, barking orders to clear the area. And that's when he saw it. One of the coffins near the far corner began to move, the lid rocking slightly, dirt falling away in thin streams. Then it stopped, and a voice, clear and low, came from inside. "Sheriff Cole, you buried the wrong ones." The lid creaked open. The sound of his name made Sheriff Mason Cole's blood turn cold. He froze, flashlight trembling on the coffin that had just shifted. The crowd behind the barricade screamed and scattered, leaving the graveyard echoing with footsteps and panic. Mason stepped closer, every instinct screaming at him to back away. The coffin lid moved again, slow, deliberate, until it tilted open just enough to reveal what was inside. But there was no body, no bones, only a soaked, folded uniform. An old sheriff's jacket with the Cedar Hollow badge still pinned to the chest. The name tag read Cole. He stumbled backward, breath catching in his throat. His grandfather, Sheriff Thomas Cole, had worn that badge. He'd died 40 years ago, long before Mason was even born. But the coffin had been sealed in the family plot near the church, not here. Dr. Eliza Marin rushed over, snapping photos. "Sheriff, that's your family insignia. Are you sure this grave belongs here?" Mason shook his head. "No, that's not possible." They pried open the coffin fully. Beneath the uniform lay an old revolver, rusted and covered in clay. Etched on the handle were 5 initials, the same initials that matched victims from the old mining camp records Reverend Price had mentioned. Eliza looked at him uneasily. "It's like whoever opened these graves wanted you to find this." That night, Mason sat in his office with the revolver on his desk, rain hammering against the windows. He called his aunt, the last living relative who remembered Thomas Cole. Her voice on the other end was shaking. "Your granddaddy. He wasn't just a sheriff, Mason. He was part of that mining company. He helped bury those men without ceremony. It's why our family's never been buried in the churchyard. The town called it a curse." Mason's stomach twisted. "You mean he covered it up?" "They said he sealed the truth with the dead, promised their families he'd bless the graves later, but the church burned down before he could. Some said the ground never forgave him." Thunder rolled outside. Mason stared at the revolver, then at the cemetery through his window. The mist was back, thicker now, creeping through the trees like smoke. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, unable to sit still. When he arrived at the cemetery, Eliza and Reverend Price were already there, standing near the oldest graves. The air smelled like rain and iron. Eliza held the ancient church ledger in her hands, its pages fluttering in the wind. "Sheriff," she said, "I translated the rest of the passage. It says the unblessed can only rest if the descendant of the guilty returns what was stolen." Mason frowned. What was stolen? Before she could answer, the church bell, silent for decades, began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound rolled through the fog, deep and hollow. Then, one by one, the graves began to move again. Eliza dropped the book. Reverend Price clutched his cross. Mason lifted his light toward the churchyard. And there, in the doorway of the ruined chapel, stood a figure wearing an old sheriff's coat, badge gleaming in the rain. The man raised his hand slowly, pointing straight at Mason. And the bell rang a 4th time. For a long moment, Mason couldn't move. The figure in the doorway looked solid, not like a ghost or trick of the light, but real. Water streamed down the brim of the old sheriff's hat, the same kind his grandfather used to wear in photographs. When lightning flashed, Mason saw the man's eyes, pale, clouded like glass, staring straight through him. "Granddad?" Mason whispered. The word left his mouth before he could stop it. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and started walking slowly toward the cemetery, boots sinking into the wet soil. Each step echoed like a hammer striking stone. Behind Mason, Eliza and Reverend Price backed away, but Mason stepped forward, heart pounding. The storm's wind howled through the open graves. "Thomas Cole!" Mason called out, his voice barely holding steady. "If you're here for justice, tell me what you want." The figure stopped beside the open coffin where Mason had found the uniform. Its hand lifted, pointing again toward the old church ruins. Then a whisper, faint but unmistakable, slid through the air. "Return what was taken." Mason followed the pointing hand toward the altar inside the collapsed chapel. The pews were blackened from the fire that destroyed the church over a century ago. Beneath the crumbled stone, Mason saw something metallic glint in the flashlight beam. He knelt, brushing away dirt and ash. There, buried beneath a fallen beam, were dozens of small brass tags, nameplates from the miners' graves that had never been marked. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. The town had buried the workers anonymously to save the mining company's reputation, and his grandfather had hidden their identities beneath the altar, stealing their names from history. That was what had cursed the ground. Eliza's voice trembled. "If those are their names, we have to return them to the graves. That's what the written tool meant, to restore their rest." Mason nodded, gathering the rusted tags carefully into a bag. The storm outside grew violent as thunder rolled like cannon fire. When he stepped out of the chapel, the cemetery was alive. The graves trembling, wind spinning dead leaves into small whirlwinds. The pale figure stood among them, silent, waiting. One by one, Mason laid the tags on the headstones. With each one placed, the trembling slowed. The air seemed to grow lighter. Eliza whispered prayers as she helped, her voice barely audible over the storm. By the time the last tag was returned, the figure of Thomas Cole was only a faint shadow in the mist. He gave a slow nod before fading completely. Then, silence. The wind stopped. The church bell gave one last hollow toll and fell still. The next morning, Cedar Hollow woke to calm skies. The graves were filled, neat and undisturbed, as though they had never been opened. Mason stood alone by the gate, watching the sunlight cut through the fog. He felt the weight of what his family had done, and what he had finally undone. But just as he turned to leave, his radio crackled. A deputy's shaky voice came through. "Sheriff, you need to see this. There's been a disturbance at the Old Town Records office. Every page listing the miners' deaths. It's blank. Their names are gone again. Mason looked back toward the cemetery. The fog had started to move, rolling slowly across the gravestones, creeping back toward town. And this time, the bell began to ring by itself.